How's it going, everyone? My name is Falling Hurts, and whether you've seen my last video about Redfall, the characters of Redfall, or this is your first one, today we'll be going over the enemies of Redfall. And this is the second video in my bite-sized series of videos that are meant to catch you up on all the aspects of Redfall that we know right now. The reason for doing so is I would hate to do all this information about Redfall in one video, especially considering we know so much, and just for the video to not do well. So it's kind of a selfish reason for me, so consider subscribing, and it makes it all just a little bit more worth it for me. I'm on my way to 750 subscribers. That's my current goal. Anyways, right into the video. So we know quite a bit about the enemies of Redfall. First off, let's talk about the big one, the vampires. The developers have talked at length about how the vampires differ from the lore and mythology of vampires. For instance, these ones aren't bat-derived any longer, and they're more of the perfect specimen killing machine, which they become more monstrous the more powerful they get. And I'll talk about that hierarchy in just a second, but there are some things that they do play into. For instance, the stake to the heart does still seem to do somewhat the trick, and they still love blood-sucking, of course, but now they have psychic powers as well. And another interesting thing they know is that while they did push back the sun because they have the fear of the sun, they also pushed back the sea because they can't cross running water, and it was a happy accident in development, so a cool little tidbit for you there. Jumping in with a little bit of extra insight that we got from the QuakeCon panel, there's a few things about the vampires that I really like. First off, they're an allegory for the rich and the powerful, aka the bloodsuckers of society today. You know, the top 1%, however you want to call it. This has kind of been mentioned in the marketing up to this point, but it really wasn't honed in until now. I really don't think I like how heavily they lean into those themes in the marketing of the game. I'd kind of rather they let the game speak for itself in that regard. But, you know, it is what it is. I really think it could be a good kind of parallel. However, I'm a little worried with how much they have to tell us that in advance that it's not going to come off that way whatsoever. But hopping back around to the vampires themselves, we start out with the very basic minion type enemy. We're going to move on to a hulking, more brutish type vampire. We know about the angler, which is one that can hook you and draw you away from your team or pull you away solo if that's how you're playing as well. And these seem specifically dangerous as they also can seemingly turn invisible. We also know that there is going to be a vampire that acts as like a lookout or alarm. Basically, they'll go off and alert all the others whenever that happens. Another one that we get keyed into is actually the Rook, which it may have been shown in a trailer, I'm not sure. We don't actually get a lot of faces for these names as of right now, but the way they talk about the Rook is that they show up during storms, which kind of also confirms dynamic weather on the island as well. But that's not what today's video is about. We'll do the world of Redfall perhaps next, but for right now, we know that the Rook is another powerful vampire that you need to be wary of. Then finally, we have the bosses, or the godlike vampires that are at the top of the food chain, and the ones that seemingly are our high-value targets that are blocking out the sun and pushing back the sea, and controlling the cultists. And once again, like I said, I tried to move up the kind of vampire food chain, as it were, in a way that made sense, and you can imagine as each of these vampires becomes more and more prevalent, you'll see that they're much more monstrous than the ones before. But with that being said, let's talk a little bit more about how these vampires were created, and something that I talked a little bit about in the character video in comparison to Layla Ellison, one of the player characters. The vampires are actually a lot more scientific than you may think, as they were created in a lab, and not something that is mythical or demonic in nature. What starts out as a longevity experiment, basically looking to create immortality or the increase of human life, leads later into the vampiric side effects, and eventually the evolution into the monstrous vampires at the top of the food chain. How this ties in with Layla is that she had a very similar situation. Being experimented on and tested, she gets her own psychic powers as well, another thing that the vampires are said to have had that separates them from normal vampires in different media. Another interesting thing about the vampirism is that it actually was a mistake of Avum Therapeutics, just as I had theorized in this video previously. But more importantly, that the vampires of the game wanted to be vampires. It was a choice. And leading into that, the cultists want to be turned as well. That's why they're worshipping the vampires, so they can appease them, and they will get chosen next to be turned. Because the vampire and the turner need to be chosen. But what's super interesting, and this really feeds into that 1% versus the common people that worship them argument, the bootlickers, is that the vampire can choose what they turn the cultists or whoever into. It could be a normal vampire that they turn them into, or something more twisted like a blood bag, which is basically just cattle for the vampires to feed on, and they produce an excess amount of blood, and that's really about it. And I'm sure, you know, for a gameplay reason, they'll have something to attack us with as well, like exploding or something. But really, I thought that was really cool, and leading into the allegories that I mentioned earlier about how it's inspired by the top 1%, the bloodsuckers of the world, is that there are always going to be common people who feed into that logic. For instance, there are plenty of people out there who will die literally sucking the dick of Elon Musk if that's what they wanted to do. I don't necessarily hate Elon Musk. That's not what I'm getting at whatsoever. I think he's kind of an entertaining person. However, there are real issues with some of the things he does and talks about, and there are people that will die on the cross basically saving him. And that's kind of what these cultists are meant to represent as well, I'm pretty sure. You know, hope she sees this, bro, you know what I mean? I'm really curious to see if there's any story implications that do play out because Layla is very connected to the vampires, or seemingly so. We also know that some company on the island has called in Jacob Boyer as well as the rest of his mercenary friends to do something on the island. We don't know much about it right now, but we can assume it could have been that or a rival company, and it could all go to shit pretty quick, but we'll have to wait and see. Overall, pretty exciting though. Now, before we move on to the cultists, there is one final aspect of the vampires that I thought was pretty interesting, and this is something that will come up quite a bit during the gameplay section, but for right now, let's talk about psychic remnants and the psychic nests of the vampires. Vampires can kind of get high and trip together in something called a blood trance, and that's when they enter these psychic nests. And basically, this is a shared mind state that doesn't adhere to normal laws and architectural designs, so everything is all crazy. You go through a movie theater and it's actually a doorway. It's all kind of weird stuff, but from a gameplay perspective, what's important to note here is that they're not actually required, per se. However, at the heart of these nests is actually something called a psychic remnant. And to get to these remnants, you'll be going through a bunch of different tile sets of procedurally generated nests. So all these nests will never be exactly the same, which is really interesting to me. Something that will, in increased playthroughs, provide a variety of new things to do, and even in late game when you want to turn up the difficulty and something of an end game thing to continue to test yourself, maybe this will be a pretty fun thing to do. But circling back around to those remnants for a second, this is actually something that's pretty interesting from the vampire's perspective as well. For a story perspective, the idea of a remnant is that it's like an object that a vampire had when it turned into a vampire originally. An example was given that there could have been a rabbit's foot on their keychain or some object, and that is turned into a remnant, a very powerful item that you can use to imbue your weapons or your character in a multitude of different ways. We'll go into that and more when they share more, if we're being honest, but they're basically magical items to get the idea across. And the idea of going through these nests to get these magical items is really cool to me. To show more, there are the ward remnants, which are defensive, the blood remnants, and then also the soul remnants. And we don't know too much about them as of right now, but they do get pretty weird as per the developer Harvey Smith. So I think that's all pretty cool and a very interesting setup for the Vampire Menace, but let's talk a little bit more about their understudies and their lackeys, the Cultists. And this is actually a lot more cut and dry than you may think. Cultists are your basic FPS enemy who is armed with weapons and are facing you in the exact same way. The only difference is they believe in vampire superiority. Whether they've been mind-controlled or they just simply believe that vampires are the way to do it, it remains to be seen completely. But these cultists are going to have outposts, stronghold type things that you need to take over, very Far Cry style. And once again, I'll go more into gameplay speculation in a different video, but I like to lay the groundwork in previous videos to get the idea brought up. And we don't know if these strongholds are actually going to be the idea of taking back the neighborhood, you clear them out and more people will move in. But that's an idea that I did talk about in the previous NPC video. But regardless, you're going to want to stealth around or at the very least kill everyone before they can alert more people to come around. An interesting thing to note is that there could be vampires walking among these cultists, so you really need to look out for them as they're going to be much harder to kill. During the same interview that I mentioned Harvey Smith from, he did also talk about how they like the procedural generation of their AI to be a big focus on these games, as much as the level design, say, in those nests earlier. And what he mentions as an example is when in a Dishonored game, when you lead two factions to each other and they start fighting each other on their own without your help. During QuakeCon, something I talk about in this video, they confirmed that Jacob's unit, the other military force that's on the island, is going to be an antagonistic force. Something that I theorized, but it wasn't confirmed up until this point. So this is a confirmation that we have vampires. They're cultists, the higher up vampires if you really want to consider them on a different plane of existence, and then now, of course, Jacob's mercenary unit, which is a full-blown military force. But with that being said, I've covered the vampires at length, and I've covered their lackeys, the cultists, as well as the potential threat of a military force to some degree. Thank you so much for watching this video. My name is Falling Hearts, and if this video was at all informative, go ahead and subscribe, or stay tuned for the next video, or go watch the last one about the characters, more specifically the protagonists as well as NPCs. But hey, next up we get to move into the world of Redfall.